Welcome to the Debrief, Carolina Journal's weekly recap of major developments in North Carolina politics and public policy. I'm Mitch Kokai, sitting in this week for Donna King, and we're going to have a very jam-packed edition of the Debrief this time around. Some late-breaking news involving the General Assembly, also the aftermath of the signing of Iryna's law, which has been the major political news in North Carolina in recent weeks. And we'll touch on some other topics that have been hitting the headlines at carolinajournal.com. We'll also want to hear your comments and thoughts about the subjects that we're discussing, other subjects that you'd like to see on the Debrief. Please be sure to like and subscribe to the program, leave comments when you watch online. We love to hear what you think about the show. That helps us as we move forward with the program going forward in the future. Well, joining me for this discussion today, we've got a very good panel this time around. We have John Guzay sitting to my right, who is a senior fellow in legal studies at the John Locke Foundation and has been looking very closely at the Iryna's law issue, plus the overall issue of crime in North Carolina and what to do about it. And on the other couch, we have two of our Carolina Journal reporters. Teresa Opeka is the executive branch reporter for Carolina Journal. And Katie Zender has been working on a lot of issues dealing with tariffs, agriculture in North Carolina. She spent a lot of time at the General Assembly with its last session, so both of them will bring their Carolina Journal expertise to the topics today. Well, first of all, I wanted to talk about an issue that we weren't expecting to discuss, the General Assembly not operating in Raleigh at this time, but that doesn't mean that the legislature isn't the top of our news for the Debrief. We had news during the past day that Representative Cecil Brockman, a Democrat from Guilford County, has been arrested. He's been charged with taking indecent liberties with a child and statutory rape. At this point, as we're recording, not a whole lot of more details. We were still awaiting Representative Brockman making his first court appearance, where you'll learn more about this, but already some reaction from some of his colleagues. Now, Cecil Brockman is a Democrat. The Democratic leader in the State House is Robert Reeves, and he issued this statement on social media. The allegations against Representative Brockman are serious, and if true, would disqualify him from public office. This is a developing situation, and it is important to let the legal process unfold. Now, among other Democratic colleagues, some more forceful stances, among them Representative Brian Cohn, who responded fairly early saying, "I'm deeply disturbed by the news that Representative Cecil Brockman has been charged with indecent liberties with a child and statutory rape. These allegations are unconscionable and incompatible with public service. He should resign immediately. No one is above the law." On the other side of the fence, the overall leader of the State House of Representatives, Representative Destin Hall, a Republican, he wrote, the charges against Representative Brockman are shocking and extremely serious. Given the evidence that's publicly known, he should resign immediately so these charges do not distract from the work of the North Carolina House. So the Republican leader, Destin Hall, calling for Cecil Brockman to resign immediately. On the other side, Representative Robert Reeves, the top Democrat in the House, saying that these are serious and, if true, disqualifying charges, but he's also saying a developing situation and it's important to let the legal process unfold. As we were preparing for the program, Teresa, we were talking about the fact that one of the political angles that goes beyond the very serious charges here, and that's what's important at this stage, but one of the political angles is that Representative Brockman, while being a Democrat, has been one of the Democrats most likely to side with Republicans when there's a partisan fight. So what happens to Representative Brockman could have an impact on legislation moving forward, couldn't it?
Yeah, most definitely. It's going to be interesting to see if he does resign or if somehow they do pull him out of office, if that is an option. That what's going to happen for Republicans. You know, they don't have a supermajority anymore for overriding vetoes, so it would be definitely interesting to see what is going to happen down the line as far as having a few Democrats come over to the Republican side to agree on different bills. I know he was for marriage equality. I saw that he was involved with that. So yeah, time will tell, but yeah, it doesn't bode well for Republicans to lose another vote.
Yeah, now he's not the only one who has jumped shift from Democrats to support the Republicans, but he has been one of the few who's done it on more than one occasion.
Yes.
So despite that fact, we know that Destin Hall is already saying, regardless of what's happening, that the charges in and of themselves should prompt Representative Brockman to resign.
Yeah.
And of course, we'll be following this closely. By the time you are watching this, there may be more developments. This is really early in the stages. And of course, we should point out, as in any case of criminal charges, that people should be presumed innocent until proven guilty, that we don't know that Representative Brockman is guilty of anything. He has only been charged at this point, and more details will come out as this case moves forward. Now let's move on to what we were originally expecting to spend most of our time talking about on this program, and that is what has happened in the aftermath of the passage of Iryna's law. By the time that the last debrief was produced, Iryna's law was still sitting in Governor Josh Stein's hands. We didn't know for certain whether he would sign it, veto it, or allow it to become law without his signature. He did sign it, but went about it in kind of an interesting way. Teresa, you wrote about this at CarolinaJournal.com. Tell us about Governor Josh Stein's response to Iryna's law.
Yeah, and he did it at the last minute because it was the last possible day that he could have signed it, vetoed it, or let it go into law without his signature. So yeah, he had a video announcement, not a press release, not a press conference, just a video announcement saying, when he reviews public safety legislation, the one thing he does is, at the simple test, is it make people safe. So he says, so overall, Iryna's law alerts the judiciary to take a special look at people who may pose unusual risks of violence before determining their bail. And that's a good thing, and that's why he said he signed it into law. However, he said it didn't go far enough. So what he said is the law fails to focus appropriately on the threat that people pose rather than their ability to post bail. He called a last-minute amendment of execution by firing squad barbaric, and that would not happen under his watch. That was the one thing he said. So what he said is he would like to call the legislators back to Raleigh to, of course, come and pass his comprehensive public safety package that includes more cops on the beat, violence prevention measures, keeping kids out of gangs, people off of drugs, and acknowledging the role that guns and mental health play. So that's what he was saying, that he wanted to call, the General Assembly back to pass his package.
And of course, the General Assembly, regardless of what Governor Stein wants to do, is scheduled to come back later in October, and also for a couple of days at a time in the months to come. I want to turn now to John Guzet. We mentioned you're the Senior Fellow in Legal Studies. You have been focusing on issues related to crime and punishment and what North Carolina ought to do to make things better moving forward. We're going to get to some of your ideas in just a bit, but first, in following this Iryna's law debate, what was your take on what the General Assembly was looking at and whether they're looking at the right things?
Well, it's not often that I agree with Josh Stein about anything, but I do agree that this is a good bill. It will make people safer, and it does focus on some of the right issues, but as he said, it doesn't go far enough. Now, I disagree about some of the things we should be doing instead, but I do agree that we need to do more, even than Iryna's bill does, to ensure that people with severe mental illnesses who are a danger to themselves and others are involuntarily committed. We just can't go on allowing people like Iryna's killer to live on the streets unmedicated. It's bad for everybody because it makes us unsafe, but it's bad for these people too. People like Iryna's killer aren't happy living on the streets. They're suffering from paranoid delusions, as he was. They hear voices, often abusive voices. They're vulnerable to all kinds of predation themselves, and of course they can't care for themselves. They can't support themselves at any kind of reasonable level. So it's not humane. We've just got to change the system. And the good news is, I think we're going to see some improvements along those lines. The House Speaker has just convened a select committee that's going to be looking at involuntary commitment, and that's good. And if I'm not mistaken, the bill also includes $1 million for a study of what it is called the nexus between mental illness, and crime.
And that, in fact, was one of the things when I first saw this law that kind of impressed me, was that it wasn't just looking at lock them up, throw away the key, let's punish judges and magistrates who let people go. There is some of that, but it did also mention some of these issues of mental health. And as you said, Representative Destin Hall, the Speaker of the House, has set up a new committee that's going to be looking on this, so potentially some other positive developments. One thing I wanted to touch on was you have been looking at these issues for years and years, long before this issue. Oh, and I also wanted to point out, we mentioned, did mention him by name, but DeCarlos Brown Jr., I guess we should say alleged killer at this point. I mean, all the video evidence seems to suggest that he is, but if for some reason he's not found guilty, we would.
Well, if he's not found guilty, it'll be by reason of insanity.
Yeah. So, but as I started to say, you have been focusing on these issues for a long time. You have a forthcoming report from the John Locke Foundation that'll be looking at some of these issues related to crime. And what are some of the highlights of that, and how could that help in terms of dealing with crime and this threat that people are seeing now after Iryna Zarutska's killing of violent crime?
Well, I think it's important to remember it's not the primary lesson we should take from the killing, but he didn't have a ticket. He was riding that train without a ticket. I mean, there's all kinds of reasons why he never should have been on that train. But one of them is he was able to board without a ticket, and I think it's relevant because what people used to call broken windows policing works, and enforcing preventing fare evasion is part of broken windows policing. I think that in the long run, regardless of whether or not having more police in the transit system in Charlotte would have helped save this particular life, having more police in public spaces unquestionably will save lives down the line. And another good thing to come out of this tragedy is that Representative Burke, is that her name, has had a press conference in which she made some proposals, including more supplemental funding for police to get more police officers on the streets in high crime areas. And apparently Governor Stein wants to do that too. So again, that's a rare instance in which I'm in agreement with. I think we need more cops.
And that's actually been one of your key themes for years and years.
More cops, less crime.
More cops will lead to less crime. So we will be following the aftermath of Iryna's law. I'm certain that this is not the last time we're hearing this issue, especially since, as we mentioned, Representative Hall has this new committee. That committee will certainly have some sort of recommendations for the General Assembly, if not in the coming weeks, probably then for the short session in 2026. I want to bring Katie in now. We haven't had a chance to chat with you yet, but one of the things that you had a chance to write about was our former House Speaker,
Yes.
Tim Moore, who's now in Congress, has put forward a piece of legislation that was inspired by the Iryna Zarutska killing. And in fact, Representative Moore was one of the people who came down to Charlotte for a congressional field hearing talking about these issues. Tell us about the bill that he's put forward.
Right, yeah, so as you mentioned, he was down here for that Charlotte hearing in the wake of Iryna's death. And so one of the things that we've really seen brought to light in the wake of her death is that these violent criminals, repeat offenders, are being allowed to run around on the streets and not being held until their hearing or until their trial. And we saw that not only with Iryna, but with Logan Frederico, who was brought up during the Charlotte hearing. She was a North Carolina native. I believe she was visiting friends at USC, I think in Columbia, South Carolina. She was drug out of bed in the middle of the night and shot in the back of the head. Her father gave a very emotional testimony during that hearing. And so victims like Logan and like Iryna are becoming victims because these repeat offenders are being allowed to run around on the streets. And so Moore's law would actually address, make judges civilly liable for releasing violent criminals. It would create a pathway to lawsuits when a bond or sentencing decision is made, quote, with gross negligence or intentional disregard for public safety. And so, but it also goes so far as to protect judges that do act in good faith and that do act with, or within the ordinary judicial discretion. So judges are given some immunity and some discretion, but it also goes and provides a pathway for the victims and the families that do suffer from this, that they can sue these judges if they feel that it's made a decision is made with gross negligence or disregard for public safety. And so Jeanette Doran, who's the Constitutional Studies Counsel for John Locke, she had some comments. She said, this is a small but significant departure from the norms of judicial immunity. She said it could open the door to the removal of broader immunity, and we should be careful about punishing judges for their decisions, even for bad decisions. And then she said, quote, of course Moore's bill doesn't go that far, but we need to think about how removing some judicial immunity today could end up to extend to the removal of more, even all immunity in the future.
Very interesting stuff. And of course, Jeanette Doran, one of our colleagues. John, you were saying before we started that's one of your concerns as well about this bill.
Well, it is. It's true. I'm ambivalent about it because in general, I think that even people who work for the government ought not to be immune. They ought to be held liable for their mistakes, just like the rest of us. But Jeanette's raised some good points about this may be a slippery slope. But a couple other things I want to say about that. First is this should not be a federal matter. This is for us to resolve here in North Carolina, I think. And related to that, regardless of whether this is a good approach to it, there is a problem with repeat offenders who ought to be held pending trial and are released and then go on to commit crimes. This was a particularly egregious example of that, but this is something that needs to be addressed. And I'm happy to say that also in response to this tragedy, Chief Justice Newby of the North Carolina Supreme Court has convened a task force to look at pretrial release policies in North Carolina, and I think that's very good. Yet another instance of me agreeing with the governor is that we need less focus on bond and more focus on how we can simply hold people without bond if there's reason to think they're a danger to the community. And I'm hoping that's what's going to happen.
And this may be a case where has to be some sort of legislative work, because if there are people out there who need to be kept behind bars, my guess is there's going to be need to be more space for them, and that means more spending on that space. Teresa, you've been following the General Assembly. Anytime that people ask them for more money for something, that sometimes runs into a brick wall.
Oh yeah, it does. It does. So it'd be interesting to see what's going to happen. As you mentioned about needing more spaces, it's been infamous over the past couple of decades how they have closed different mental institutions or asylums for people who had some of these mental issues. More so on the far left are calling for all prisoners to be released from jail, things of that nature. We don't want to go that way, but yeah, as far as funding from the General Assembly, they take a hard look. But sometimes they do, come to a compromise on that. So it'll be interesting to see what's going to happen with that.
And perhaps that's a one of the few positives you could get out of this Iryna Zarutska case is that if it focuses more attention on resolving some of these issues, that could be a good thing. Well, let's move on. This is something I'm sure that is going to be the source of discussion again, whether it involves Iryna Zarutska's name or not. We're going to be talking about these issues of crime and punishment. I'm sure we'll have John Guzet back on again to talk about his report once it is out, and we have more of the details that we can share with you. Let's move on now. This particular week was also important, not just in North Carolina, nationally and internationally. It is the anniversary once again of October 7th. And one of the things, Teresa, that you wrote about on CarolinaJournal.com this week was how various lawmakers, both at the state level and federal level here in North Carolina, were responding to that anniversary.
Yeah, such a tragic day, and they had some remembrances on that day, and they issued different statements, and it went, of course, all the way from President Trump all the way down to our state legislators. And going and looking at that, we had, Governor Josh Stein, who himself is of the Jewish faith. He said this: Hamas's acts of unspeakable violence took 1,200 lives from us, and we honor those killed by recommitting ourselves to living and work of the repairing the world, and we continue to pray for the immediate and safe return of the 48 people still held hostage, which, as we're speaking today, the first phase of President Trump's 20-point peace plan is going into effect. Hopefully, they're going to have a ceasefire between Israel and Gaza, release the 48 hostages on Monday. Sadly, only 20 of those are reported alive, including 2 Americans. So that's supposed to be taking place sometime over the weekend. They're holding different, celebrations in Israel at this point, and asking for a Nobel Peace Prize for President Trump. But just to want to update on that as a current event at the moment. But yeah, a lot of this was brought to light over this past week. We heard from every one of the North Carolina congressional contingent. We had Senators Ted Budd, also Tom Tillis, who made comments. And Tom Tillis made a comment about Keith Siegel, who was a Chapel Hill native, who was released earlier this year after being held hostage for about a year and a half. His wife was let go, I think, about 50 some days after October 7th of 2023. And Siegel himself spoke in Central Park last weekend, very hopeful for Trump's plan. And I know I did some earlier reporting, and Katie also did some reporting on him as well.
Right, yeah. So as Teresa mentioned, Keith Samuel Siegel is a Chapel Hill native. Not only that, but he was the first American hostage to be released when he was released earlier this year on February 1st. Him and his wife, Aviva, were both taken captive on October 7th. Aviva was held for 51 days, and then she was released. And then she continued to advocate for not only his release, but the release of all the hostages. But really, since his release, he hasn't taken much of a break. He's continued to advocate for the release of the remaining hostages. About a month afterwards, I believe, he was at the White House and on Capitol Hill meeting with President Trump and congressional members advocating for the release of the remaining hostages. He was held by Hamas for 484 days. 484 days this man was held in pure hell. There's no other way to describe the conditions that he was held in. About a month after his release, he posted an Instagram video on the Hostages and Missing Families Forum, which is an organization that has fought very, very hard for the release of these hostages. And he said, "I love country music and I love pancakes on a Saturday morning, but that was my previous life. I was held for 484 days in unimaginable conditions. Every single day, it felt like it could be my last." And as Teresa mentioned, on October 7th, upwards of 1,200 people were killed, not only in these kibbutzes in the Gaza Strip, but also at the Nova Music Festivals. So these are these festivals that take place every year in Israel. And I believe about 369 young people were killed at the music festivals. So that'd be like if Hamas attacked like Coachella or Stagecoach here in America. Like that's the magnitude. It's been called one of the bloodiest days in Jewish history since the Holocaust, I think. I also learned last year when I was covering the anniversary that it's come to be known in Jewish communities as Black Sabbath. So yeah, really horrible event that we're remembering, but hopefully we'll see the return of those 48 hostages that are remaining and the 20 that are hopefully alive.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very somber occasion.
Yes.
I know during the entire course of my life, and I think probably even the entire course of your life,
And that's a long life.
This has been an issue, and we've not seen any resolution. I mean, ever since
That's right.
Israel declared its independence in the late 40s, I mean, there has been conflict, and it's only abated on occasion. So I don't know if we're going to see a result, but if there is some sort of resolution, the people who are calling for President Trump to get a Nobel Peace Prize, I think there will be some people who will support that, even if they don't necessarily like
He'll
President
have earned
Trump.
it.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's move on. One of the other big stories that has been going on now for quite a while. We haven't seen as much of it lately. It was not the source of discussion for the most part the last time lawmakers were in town, although they did devote $65 million or more to the relief efforts related to storms, but recovery in western North Carolina from Helene. Katie, you had an interesting story about work that's being done in the private sector to help the people who are recovering from Helene. Tell us about that. And you mentioned country music earlier. This also involves country music.
Right. So
That's a theme with you, country music.
You know that too well. So yeah. So country music star Eric Church, who's a North Carolina native, he grew up in Caldwell County, has been doing some work for the last several months to bring housing to Helene victims. And this story actually goes back, well, really it goes back to the Concert for Carolina that took place in October last year when Luke Combs, who's also a North Carolina native, I believe he grew up in Asheville, and Eric Church came together to bring this benefit concert to raise money for Helene victims. And they raised about $25 million with other headliners, Scotty McCreery, James Taylor, Bailey Zimmerman, other country music well-known names. And so they raised all this money, and that money was split between Combs and Church. So they each got about $12.5 million to use for hurricane relief. So Church has a nonprofit that he's had since 2013. It was founded with his wife, Catherine. It's called the Chief Cares Foundation. But since Helene has happened, most of the focus of his foundation has been focused on Helene recovery. And so back in February, he announced that he had purchased a plot through his foundation in Avery County for a housing development to build homes for Helene victims. This housing development is known as Blue Haven, and it's got about 45 to 50 homes. These are fully functional homes. They broke ground on it in April, so they've got water, hookup, utilities, sewage, all of that, fully functional homes. It's like a little community. I believe they have a community center and even a walking trail in there. Completion of these homes was finished at the end of September, and they're hoping to have their first families moving in by Thanksgiving. But this is really just, it's just the beginning for Church. He did an interview with Bobby Bones, who's a very well-known radio personality in the country music world, back in May, and he said, we're really this is just the beginning. The main goal with Eric Church's initiative here, he calls it a blueprint for the Blue Ridge, and the main goal with his initiative is, he says, when these disasters happen, a lot of times people aren't kept within their community. And so that's his goal, is to keep people within the community. Because he says when you move people, when people go out of the community and they disperse from the community, then you lose the community, because the people are the community. And so that's really his goal with this initiative. And so what he's doing is he's bringing people into these homes rent-free. They don't have to pay mortgage, they don't have to pay rent. And so once they live in these homes for 10 years, they have full ownership of the home. And so he confirmed back in May to Bobby Bones in that interview that he's actually purchased 2 more properties in Western North Carolina, and he hopes to build upwards of 200 homes. And when this started and he got all this money from the concert, organizations and charities started reaching out to him, of course, obviously. And so he said he found a void, and that was that no one was doing anything about housing. And so that's where this initiative came from. And so he started reaching out to his network, which includes CEO of Clayton Homes, Kevin Clayton. So Kevin Clayton, who's a local, kind of business owner here in North Carolina, has also been a part of bringing this initiative. And so he's hoping to have those families moving into the first development in Blue Haven in Avery County by Thanksgiving. Applications are now open for people that do want to apply. I know there's a few processes you have to go through. I believe you have to go through a background check. But yeah, so that's really what's been going on. And also, the AmeriHealth and AMY Wellness Foundation have also partnered with Chief Cares to invest $6 million in this Blue Haven development. So a lot of companies are partnering with him to bring this to light. And one thing that I also thought was really interesting is he released a single last year called Darkest Hour, and most people thought that was written after Helene. He actually wrote that 10 days before Helene hit. And he said he was driving back from an event in Florida, Hurricane Helene hit, and he said, I got back home and I remember seeing the devastation, which I couldn't fathom being from that area. I didn't recognize any of the areas that I knew immediately. And so when he saw this, he called his producer, I believe his name is John Peets, and he said, we have to release the single early. I believe that single was not supposed to be released until this year. But he said, I think that if we don't release this now, we're going to regret it. Now, the interesting thing is all the publishing royalties from that song have been signed over to the people of North Carolina.
Yeah, very interesting stuff from Eric Church. I know you're going to be continuing to follow this very closely, and we will be following Helene and all of the recovery that continues as it moves forward. That's all the time that we have this week for the debrief, but we thank you for watching. We certainly welcome your comments. Please like and subscribe. Tell us what you'd like to cover in the future, and we will be back with you again next week with another edition of the Debrief.